I want you to do something for me. Reach into your wallet and pull out a $1 bill. If you don't have cash, pull up an image on your phone. Observe the back of the bill and look at the left side. You see an unfinished pyramid made of 13 steps. At the top, floating in a triangle of light, is an eye, the all-seeing eye. Below it, the Latin phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. If you spend enough time on the internet, you will find thousands of people who will tell you exactly what this means. They will tell you it's proof of the Illuminati. They will tell you it's a symbol of Lucifer. They will tell you it's a secret signal that a cabal of wizard elites is controlling the world through blood magic. It makes for a great Nicolas Cage movie, but the reality is much more boring, and honestly, much more impressive. That symbol isn't magic, it's branding. It is the logo of the social network that built the United States. You see, we tend to think of the Founding Fathers as these lonely geniuses, sitting in their studies by candlelight coming up with great ideas in isolation. But that's not how revolutions work. Revolutions require command and control networks. They require communication. And most importantly, they require trust. In 1776, you couldn't send an encrypted text on Signal. You couldn't create a private Slack channel. If you wanted to organize a rebellion against the most powerful empire on earth, you had a problem. The king read the mail. The tavern keepers were spies. The churches were divided by sect. So where could a deist from Philadelphia, a Presbyterian from Boston, and an Anglican from Virginia meet in secret, look each other in the eye, and know, without a shadow of a doubt, that they could trust each other? They met in the lodge. The story of the American Revolution isn't just about what happened on the battlefield. It's about what happened in the meeting room. It's about a fraternity called the Freemasons. And once you understand how this network operated, you realize that the United States wasn't founded on the cross. It was founded on the square and compass. You are listening to False Foundation. I'm Jim. We are here to dismantle the Christian nationalist myths of the American founding and look at the cold, hard mechanics of how our republic was actually built. No idols, no pedestals, just the facts. Let's move out. To understand why Freemasonry was so vital to the founding, you have to understand the communication environment of the 18th century. It was a low-trust environment. If you were a merchant traveling from Boston to Charleston, you were a stranger. You had no credit score. You had no LinkedIn profile. No one knew if you were a man of your word or a con artist. And politically, it was even worse. If you started talking about liberty to the wrong person at a pub, you could end up hanging from a rope for treason. Enter the Freemasons. Historians often call Freemasonry the Invisible College. I prefer to think of it as the VPN of the Enlightenment. It was a private, encrypted network that ran parallel to the public society. To get in, you had to be vetted. You had to be voted in. You had to prove you were a man of character. And once you were in, you had the encryption keys. The handshakes, the passwords, the weird hand signs that conspiracy theorists love to obsess over, they weren't role play, they were authentication protocols. If Benjamin Franklin walked into a lodge in Paris, which he did famously, at the Loge des Neuf Sœurs, he could give the specific grip to a man he had never met, and that man would instantly know, this guy is cleared, he's one of us, I can talk freely. This is how the hardware of the revolution was built. We talked in the last episode about deism being the software, the philosophy of reason. Well, Freemasonry was the hardware, the servers that the software ran on. But before we look at the founders, we have to look at the history of the hardware itself. How did a guild of stonecutters turn into a secret society of philosophers? It starts with the distinction between operative and speculative masonry. In the Middle Ages, Masons were operative. They were guys who literally cut rocks to build cathedrals. They had secret handshakes for a practical reason. They were illiterate, and they traveled from job site to job site. The handshake was their resume. It proved you were a master mason and not just an apprentice. It was a trade union. But by the 1700s, the cathedrals were built. The trade was dying. So to keep the lights on, the lodges started accepting members who weren't stonecutters. They started accepting gentleman masons, lawyers, doctors, scientists. This is the shift to speculative masonry. They stopped building walls made of brick and started building a society made of ideas. But they kept the tools. They took the gavel, used to break off the rough edges of a stone, and turned it into a symbol for breaking off the rough edges of your personality. They took the square, used to check 90-degree angles, and turned it into a symbol of morality. Are you square with your neighbor? They took the level, used to lay floors, and turned it into a symbol of equality. By the time George Washington joined in 1752, the lodge wasn't a construction site, it was a think tank. And the man who scaled this network in America was none other than Benjamin Franklin. Franklin wasn't just a member, he was the sysadmin. In 1734, Franklin used his printing press in Philadelphia to reprint James Anderson's Constitutions of the Freemasons. This was the first Masonic book ever printed in America. Franklin realized early on that this network was the key to uniting the colonies. He used the Masonic distribution channels to send mail, share scientific discoveries, and eventually coordinate political resistance. When Paul Revere rode out on his famous midnight ride, he wasn't just shouting at random farmhouses. He was activating a specific network of local militia leaders. Many of him he knew through the Lodge of St. Andrew in Boston. The lodge provided something that a church couldn't: a neutral zone. In the 1700s, a Quaker and a Baptist wouldn't be caught dead in the same church. They thought the other one was going to hell. But in the lodge, they were brothers. They were bound by a code that explicitly forbade the discussion of sectarian religion. This created a SCIF, something that's known in the military and government as a sensitive compartmented information facility. It was a room where the normal rules of British society didn't apply. Inside the lodge, a blacksmith could be the master, and a wealthy landowner could be a regular member. Rank was based on merit, not birth. Think back to the religious landscape that we mapped out in the last episode. It was a minefield of competing dogmas. The lodges offered a safe route through that terrain. They were network nodes that weren't subject to the church's purity tests. They operated completely outside the chain of command of the clergy. The founders didn't just stumble into the idea of a republic. They had been practicing it every Tuesday night for decades. Now you might be asking, Jim, if these guys were so religious about their oaths, how did they get around the Jesus problem? And you're right to ask. In the 1700s, religion wasn't just a preference, it was a tribe. An Anglican didn't trust a Presbyterian, a Protestant definitely didn't trust a Catholic, and nobody trusted a Jew. So how do you build a network that includes all of them? You push a new TTP. That's short for Tactics, Techniques, and Procedures. My grandfather was a Freemason, and I did some digging into their rulebook. What I found explains everything about the U.S. Constitution. Originally, the Masons were strictly Christian. If you weren't a Trinitarian Christian, you couldn't get in. But in 1723, the network realized that this restriction was bad for business. If you wanted to trade with the world, you needed to be able to trust men from other cultures. So they changed the rule. They stated that a Mason only needed to follow, quote, that religion in which all men agree, leaving their particular opinions to themselves, end quote. That is a thunderclap in history. In 1723, they effectively invented secularism, or at least pluralism. But there was a catch, and this is where it gets interesting for us non-believers. While they threw out Jesus, they kept God. In fact, to this day, an atheist cannot be a Freemason. Why? Because of the oath. In the 18th century mind, even the deist mind, trust was based on collateral. If I swear an oath to you on my honor, that's nice. But if I swear an oath to you on my immortal soul, that's collateral. They believed that if you didn't fear a higher power punishing you for lying, your word was garbage. The Masonic rulebook literally refers to the stupid atheist, although stupid had a different connotation back then. They believed that without a supreme being, a man had no moral anchor. You might be familiar with this argument even today. I can't tell you how many times people ask me where my morals come from if I don't have a religion. My answer is always biology, but that's another episode. So they created a brilliant workaround, a theological hack. They required you to believe in a supreme being, but they let you define who that was. You see this hiding in plain sight. Next time you see a Masonic bumper sticker, look at the logo, the square and compass. Right in the middle, there's a big letter G. That G stands for God. Some Masons will tell you it also stands for geometry, which fits the whole architect vibe. But notice what it isn't. It isn't a J for Jesus. It isn't a cross. It isn't a Star of David. It is a single, ambiguous letter. It is a variable in an equation. It's a placeholder. They gave this placeholder a generic code name, the great architect of the universe. If you were a Christian, the G was for the Father. If you were a Jew, the G was Yahweh. If you were a deist, like Franklin or Washington, the G was the prime mover of science. If you were a Native American, and yes, there were Native American Masons, It was the Great Spirit. This simple linguistic trick allowed George Washington, an Anglican, to sit in the lodge with Hayam Solomon, a Jew, and Benjamin Franklin, a deist, and treat each other as spiritual equals. They didn't have to agree on salvation, they just had to agree that there was a manager upstairs. This is the exact same logic they applied to the United States. Look at the Declaration again, endowed by their creator, nature's God, supreme judge of the world. These are Masonic terms. They are deliberately vague placeholders designed to maximize the size of the network. The founders didn't want a Christian nation because that would limit the user base. They wanted a theistic republic, a system where everyone agreed on a moral baseline, the architect, but kept their specific theology private. So we have the network and the lodges, and we have the login protocol, the great architect of the universe. Now let's look at the operating system. Historians often wonder, how did a bunch of British subjects who had lived under a monarchy their entire lives suddenly figure out how to run a republic? It's a valid question. In 1770, democracy was a dirty word. It was associated with mob rule and chaos. There were no working models in the world, or so we're told. The truth is, the founders had been running a republic for decades. They just did it behind closed doors. A quick note here. I often see the MAGA crowd rage about how we are a republic and not a democracy. For me, this is a distinction without a difference. Democracy means that the people rule. Republic means a public thing. There is a reason the first political party America had was the Democratic Republicans. Both things can be true at the same time. And regardless of what you call it, the founders needed a place to practice it. The Masonic Lodge was that place. It was the laboratory of liberty. It was a sandbox mode where they could test drive democratic ideas without the king finding out. Think about how a lodge is structured. In the outside world of the 1700s, power was hereditary. If your dad was the king, you were the king. If your dad was a lord, you were a lord. You didn't earn it, you were born with it. But inside the lodge, power was elected. Every year, the members of the lodge would hold a vote. They would elect a worshipful master to run the show. And here's the kicker. It didn't matter if you were the wealthiest merchant in Boston or a local silversmith like Paul Revere. One man, one vote. And the master didn't rule by decree, he ruled by a constitution. Every lodge had a set of bylaws. They had rules of order. They had debates. If the master violated the constitution, he would be voted out or impeached by the Grand Lodge. This is where they learned parliamentary procedure. If you've ever watched C-SPAN or sat in a town council meeting, you know the drill. I move to table the motion. Second, all in favor? This style of debate didn't come naturally to people who lived under a king. It had to be learned. In the tavern, a disagreement meant a fistfight. In the street, a disagreement meant a duel. But in the lodge, a disagreement meant a vote. The lodge taught men how to lose an argument without resorting to violence. That is the cornerstone of a civilized society. So we can see the blueprint. Written constitution? Check. Elected executive? Check. Separation of powers? Check. They had wardens to assist the master. Meritocracy? Check. When Thomas Jefferson and James Madison sat down to write the rules for the United States, they weren't starting from scratch. They were scaling up the bylaws of their fraternity. This also explains the concept of equality in the Declaration. All men are created equal. That was a laughable statement in 1776. The world was strictly hierarchical. But in the lodge, there is a concept called meeting on the level. The level is a tool used by builders to ensure a floor is flat. In Masonry, it means that the second you walk past the tiler, the guard at the door, your rank disappears. And this brings us to one of the most important logistics tools of the war, the military lodge. Most people think lodges are buildings, but in the 18th century, a lodge was a concept, not a place. Grand lodges would issue what are called traveling warrants. This was basically a lodge in a box. It authorized a specific regiment of the Continental Army to hold Masonic meetings wherever they were camped. Washington loved these. He encouraged them. Why? Because they solved a discipline problem. In the British Army, officers were aristocrats and soldiers were scum. They despised each other. But in the Continental Army, Washington needed cohesion. There are stories from the Revolutionary War of British officers and American officers who were trying to kill each other an hour earlier, meeting in a military lodge. Inside that tent, the general was just a brother, and the private was just a brother. If the private was the master of the lodge, the general had to salute him. That psychological shift, the idea that authority comes from the consent of the brethren, not from the bloodline of the king, is the engine of the American Revolution. The Christian nationalist wants you to believe that our system came from the Bible, but show me the chapter in the Bible that sets up an elected president, a Supreme Court, and a bicameral legislature. You can't, because the Bible is a book about kings and kingdoms. But open a Masonic monitor from the 1750s, and you see the blueprint for a republic staring you right in the face. So if you still think I'm exaggerating, if you think Masonry was just a bowling league for the founders, let's look at the literal foundation of the U.S. government. Let's go to September 18th, 1793. The location is Washington, D.C. The event is the laying of the cornerstone of the United States Capitol building. This is the most important building in the country. It is the temple of our democracy. A Christian nationalist might expect this ceremony to be a religious affair. They'd expect a bishop. They'd expect a choir singing hymns. They'd expect George Washington to be wearing his military uniform or a formal presidential suit. But that's not what happened. On that day, the President of the United States stepped out of his carriage wearing a Masonic apron. It wasn't a fashion statement. He was wearing the official regalia of a Master Mason. In fact, the apron he likely wore was a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette, the French general who fought with us. That apron was a symbol of the international link between the American and French revolutions. Washington was flanked not by priests, but by the officers of the Grand Lodge of Maryland and Lodge Number 22 of Virginia. And when it came time to bless the cornerstone, the literal rock upon which our government stands, Washington didn't pray to Jesus. He didn't read from the Gospels. He performed a Masonic ritual. He took 3 vessels. He pulled corn on the stone. He poured wine on the stone. He poured oil on the stone. Corn, wine, and oil. These are the wages of a Mason. They symbolize nourishment, refreshment, and joy. It is a ritual that goes back to the building of King Solomon's temple. It is ancient, it is symbolic, and it is entirely secular in the context of salvation. There was no communion. There was no mention of the Trinity. The Capitol wasn't baptized. It was consecrated. Washington used a silver trowel to tap the stone into place. You can still see that trowel today. The Masons guard it like the Holy Grail. Think about the optics of that. The father of our country, in the first public act of building the seat of government, chose to identify himself not as a general, not as a Christian, but as a builder. He was signaling to the world this new nation wasn't being built on the authority of a church. It was being built on the principles of geometry, order, and architecture. He even stated this clearly in a letter to King David's Lodge in Rhode Island in 1790. He wrote, quote, "Being persuaded that a just application of the principles on which the Masonic fraternity is founded must be promotive of private virtue and public prosperity, I shall always be happy to advance the interests of the society." End quote. Notice the words, private virtue and public prosperity, not salvation and heaven. He viewed the lodge as a civic tool, not a religious one. If the U.S. were a Christian nation, that ceremony would have been a church service. Instead, it was a lodge meeting held outdoors. So, if Freemasonry was the engine of the revolution, if Washington, Franklin, Hancock, and Revere were all proud members, why do modern Christian nationalists hate it? If you go onto a conspiracy forum today or walk into a fundamentalist church, they will tell you that Masonry is a cult. They will tell you it's the deep state. They will scream about the Illuminati. But we need to stop right there and define that word. The Illuminati wasn't a room full of wizards sacrificing goats. It was a political think tank. The Order of the Illuminati was a real organization founded in Bavaria on May 1st, 1776, literally 2 months before our Declaration of Independence. Their goal wasn't to summon demons. Their goal was to summon reason. They were radical secularists. They wanted to end the influence of the Catholic Church over the government. They wanted to replace monarchy with republicanism. It was essentially deism on steroids. And the founders knew exactly who they were. We have the receipts. In 1798, a preacher named G.W. Snyder sent a panic letter to George Washington. He sent Washington a book called Proofs of a Conspiracy, warning the president that the diabolical tenets of the Illuminati were infiltrating the United States. Washington wrote back on October 24, 1798, and he didn't sound like a man afraid of ghosts. He told Snyder that he was fully satisfied that the doctrines of the Illuminati existed. He knew they were real. But then he made a critical distinction. He said he did not believe that the lodges of Freemasons in the United States were contaminated by them. Washington viewed the Illuminati as a specific radical political movement in Europe, the Jacobins, not as a supernatural threat. But the church saw them as the ultimate enemy. And over time, the clergy lumped the Masons and the Illuminati into one big bucket of secular enemies. This fear exploded in 1826 with the William Morgan affair. Morgan was a man in upstate New York who threatened to publish a book revealing the secret handshakes and passwords of the Masons. Specifically, he was going to publish the oaths. Now, these oaths are intense. A Mason swears to keep the secrets under penalty of having his throat cut across, his tongue torn out by the root, and his body buried in the rough sands of the sea. Graphic, yes. Literal, no. The founders understood these violent oaths as metaphors for how serious the bond was. If you broke your word, you were socially dead. But to the outside world, and specifically to the church, these sounded like satanic blood pacts. Morgan disappeared. It is widely believed that local Masons kidnapped him and, let's say, removed him from the equation. This sparked a firestorm called the anti-Masonic panic. The church seized on this moment to declare a war on the lodge. Why? Because they realized that Freemasonry was doing something dangerous. It was offering men a way to be moral without being saved. The lodge taught you that you could be a good citizen, a good father, and a righteous man simply by following the great architect and using your reason. You didn't need a priest. You didn't need to be washed in the blood of the Lamb. You just needed a square and compass. To the evangelical clergy, this was terrifying. It was universalism. It was the idea that a Jew or a deist could be just as moral as a Christian. So they organized. Did you know that the very first third party in American history was the anti-Masonic Party? They held the first national public convention. They elected governors. They ran a candidate for president in 1832, William Wirt. Their entire platform was to ban Freemasons from holding public office. This was the first time in American history that the religious right organized politically to crush a secular rival. They claimed that Masons were an imperium en imperio, a state within a state. And you know what? They were right. The anti-Masons correctly identified that the lodge was an engine of autonomy. It was a machine designed to bypass religious authority. When you hear a modern preacher ranting about the Illuminati, they aren't really talking about secret handshakes. They are talking about secularism. They hate the lodge for the same reason they hate the public school system, because it teaches you that you can be a good person without their specific brand of theology. So what is the lesson of the square and compass? It's not about secret societies. It's not about finding treasure maps on the back of the Declaration of Independence. The lesson is about logistics. The founders faced a problem that looked a lot like our problem today. They lived in a world that was deeply divided. They had different religions, different backgrounds, and different economic interests. They had every reason to kill each other, but they built a protocol that allowed them to work together. They agreed to leave their particular opinions at the door. They agreed to focus on the things they held in common: the great architect, or order, the square, or morality, and the compass, self-control. They proved that you don't need a state church to have a functioning society, you just need a social compact. And a quick note on the compass: we aren't talking about the thing that points north. We are talking about the tool you used in geometry class. The founders didn't view morality as a magic needle guiding them. They viewed it as a drafting tool. They used it to draw a line around their own desires and say, I will not cross this. That is the difference between obedience and discipline. And honestly, the magnetic compass is a terrible metaphor for morality anyway. If you've ever done land navigation, you know that north isn't one thing. It's three things: true north, magnetic north, and grid north. A magnetic compass doesn't point to true north. It points to magnetic north, which is unstable. It drifts. It moves miles every year. It changes depending on where you're standing. That is exactly what religious morality is. It shifts depending on what century you live in or which preacher is shouting at you. It isn't constant. But the drafting compass, it doesn't drift. It draws a perfect circle, exactly where you place it every single time. It is rational, it is consistent, and that is what the founders were building. The United States is a Masonic invention. It is a structure built by men who believe that if you treat your neighbor as an equal and you judge him by his character rather than his creed, you can build something that lasts. So the next time you look at a dollar bill, don't look for the Illuminati, look at the eye. It's not the eye of a judgmental God waiting to send you to hell. It's the eye of the architect, watching to see if you are building the walls straight. The founders gave us the tools, they gave us the level and the plumb line, but they left the rest of the construction up to us. This has been False Foundation. If you learned something, tell a friend. If you got mad, tell me. You can send your feedback, your arguments, and your suggestions to jim@falsefoundation.com. I read everything, even the hate mail.